In 1951, a cartoon turtle taught American children how to survive a nuclear explosion. Not soldiers, not scientists, children. They sat in classrooms, hands folded on wooden desks, waiting for a siren that might mean the end of the world. And when it sounded, they were told to duck and cover. This wasn't a movie. This wasn't paranoia. This was normal. Across the United States, millions of schoolchildren rehearsed for atomic war as casually as fire drills. Air raid sirens echoed through neighborhoods. Mothers stored canned food in basements. Fathers studied government pamphlets explaining how to build a fallout shelter in the backyard. Hotels in Nevada advertised atomic sunrise views of live nuclear tests. Las Vegas casinos handed out mushroom cloud cocktails. America wasn't just preparing for nuclear war, it was practicing it. In public, with families watching. And the most unsettling part? For years, this felt ordinary. Because behind the drills, behind the smiling cartoon turtle, behind the just-in-case instructions, there was a truth the public barely understood. At any moment, with no warning, one flash could erase entire cities. And the countdown had already begun. The Cold War wasn't fought on battlefields. It was fought in classrooms, in living rooms, on black and white television screens. Children learned words like radiation before they learned algebra. They memorized survival steps before they memorized the Constitution. And while they hid under desks, military officials calculated megatons. Presidents calculated risk. And the world drifted closer to a line no one fully understood. This is the story of when America prepared for the unthinkable, when nuclear annihilation became a routine part of childhood, when sirens were practice, but the threat was real, and when the country came closer to destruction than most people ever realized. Because there was 1 week in October 1962 when practice almost became reality. October 1962. For 13 days, the world held its breath. But most Americans didn't know how close it really was. On October 16th, President John F. Kennedy was shown photographs taken by a U-2 spy plane. Grainy black and white images, long shadows, missile sites, Soviet nuclear missiles, in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. Not theory, not rumor, confirmed. If launched, those missiles could hit Washington, New York, Chicago, in minutes. Suddenly, all those school drills didn't feel abstract anymore. They felt immediate. Television didn't scream panic. There was no instant social media explosion. But behind closed doors, officials used one word repeatedly: war. Advisors debated airstrikes. Invasion plans were drafted. Bombers were placed on alert. Nuclear submarines moved into position. And somewhere in America, children were still being told to duck under desks. Let that sink in. While classrooms practiced hiding from blasts, real bombers were being armed. And here's what most people didn't know at the time. One miscommunication, one radar error, one nervous commander. That's all it would have taken. On October 27th, later called Black Saturday, a U-2 plane was shot down over Cuba. An American pilot was killed. Another U-2 accidentally drifted into Soviet airspace over Alaska. U.S. destroyers dropped practice depth charges on a Soviet submarine near Cuba. That submarine? It was carrying a nuclear torpedo. And the officers on board believed war might have already started. They debated launching it. Launching a nuclear weapon without direct confirmation from Moscow. 3 men had to agree. 2 said yes. 1 said no. That man's hesitation may have prevented a nuclear exchange. And the American public? They were grocery shopping, going to church, watching evening news broadcasts. Children were still practicing duck and cover based on the 1951 civil defense film Duck and Cover. A cheerful animated turtle named Bert showed kids how to hide from a nuclear blast by crouching under desks. The logic was simple. If you see the flash, duck. Cover your head, wait. But scientists already knew something uncomfortable. If you were close enough to the blast, a desk wouldn't save you. So why teach it? Because panic is worse than illusion. Because routine creates calm. Because if people believe there is something they can do, they are easier to manage. Civil defense wasn't just about survival. It was about control. About maintaining order in a country living under the shadow of annihilation. And it went far beyond classrooms. Across the country, black and yellow fallout shelter signs appeared on buildings. Basements were stocked with government-issued crackers and water drums. Cities conducted full evacuation simulations. Entire communities rehearsed what they would do if sirens wailed for real. In some towns, highways were designated escape routes. In others, residents were instructed to stay put, seal windows, turn off ventilation, wait. Wait for radiation to pass. But there was another side to this culture of preparation, one that feels almost surreal today. Because while schools practiced survival and families stocked canned goods, thousands of Americans traveled to Nevada to watch nuclear explosions. Las Vegas, 1950s. The sky before dawn. Hotel rooftops filled with tourists holding cocktails. Waitresses handing out atomic-themed drinks. Billboards advertising the best view of the blast. And in the distance, at the Nevada test site, a countdown began. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The desert horizon lit up like a second sun. A mushroom cloud climbed into the sky. And people cheered. They cheered. This wasn't underground testing yet. These were atmospheric detonations. Visible from highways. Visible from casinos. Visible from swimming pools. Between 1951 and 1962, over 100 above-ground nuclear tests were conducted in Nevada. Las Vegas marketed itself as the Atomic City. There were beauty contests crowned Miss Atomic Bomb. Souvenir shops sold postcards of mushroom clouds. Families posed for photos with the blast in the background. Think about that. At the same time children were being trained to survive nuclear war, other Americans were treating nuclear explosions like fireworks. But here's what wasn't advertised. Fallout doesn't respect state lines. Radiation drifted, carried by wind, across Utah, across Arizona, across ranch towns and small farming communities. Downwinders, as they would later be called, didn't know what they were exposed to. Cattle developed strange illnesses. Children developed rare cancers. For years, many were told it was coincidence. Safe levels, acceptable risk, necessary for national security. Because the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in escalation. Each test bigger than the last. More megatons, more destructive power. Hydrogen bombs replaced atomic bombs. Weapons capable of wiping out entire metropolitan regions. And the public message remained steady. Be prepared. Stay calm. Duck and cover. Meanwhile, in suburbs across America, families began digging. Backyards were torn open. Concrete shelters were installed beneath lawns. Companies sold prefabricated fallout bunkers. Advertisements promised survival for weeks underground. Canned food rations, air filtration systems, radiation meters. Magazines ran step-by-step guides. How to build your own fallout shelter. Some shelters were elaborate. Bunk beds, battery-powered radios, stockpiled medicine. Others were little more than reinforced basements. But underneath it all was a quiet question no one wanted to say out loud. If the bomb actually drops, what kind of world are you surviving into? Because nuclear war wasn't just about the blast. It was about what came after. Cities flattened, infrastructure gone, medical systems overwhelmed, radiation lingering. And yet, life above ground continued like normal. Baseball games, school dances, high school graduations. While beneath the surface, literally and psychologically, America prepared for apocalypse. And then something shifted. By the early 1960s, the fear had peaked. The Cuban Missile Crisis showed how close the world could come. 13 days, naval blockades, letters between Washington and Moscow, nuclear forces on hair-trigger alert. When it ended without missiles flying, relief washed over the country. But something else happened too. Fatigue. People couldn't live forever at that level of fear. Duck and cover drills slowly became less frequent. Atmospheric testing was banned in 1963. The spectacle faded. Fallout shelter signs began to rust. Bunkers were converted into storage rooms. The sirens stopped sounding as often. But the psychological imprint remained. A generation grew up believing the world could end at any moment, that safety was temporary, that survival might depend on seconds. And even if they rarely talk about it now, many still remember the sound of that siren. The way teachers' voices changed during drills. The way parents lowered their voices when talking about the Russians. For millions of Americans over 50, nuclear war wasn't abstract history. It was a childhood backdrop, a constant shadow. And here's the question that lingers. Did those drills protect people? Or did they simply teach a nation how to live with fear? Because for over a decade, America practiced the end of the world. In public. With children. And the most unsettling part? At the time, it made perfect sense. But here's what makes this story even more unsettling. It wasn't just schools. It wasn't just Nevada. It wasn't just October 1962. It was the infrastructure of fear. In major cities, sirens were mounted on rooftops. Thousands of them. Designed to alert entire populations within seconds. If you lived in Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, you knew that sound. Long, mechanical, rising and falling. Not a test. Not a fire truck. Something bigger. Under highways and government buildings, classified continuity plans were drafted. Where would Congress go? Where would the president go? How long could leadership survive underground? Facilities like Mount Weather Emergency Operations Center were built in secret. Massive underground complexes, independent power, communication systems, food storage. Because while the public was told to duck under desks, the government was building mountains to hide inside. Let that contrast settle in. Children had wooden desks. Officials had reinforced bunkers carved into rock. And then there were the drills that almost went wrong. In 1979, a training simulation accidentally triggered alerts at NORAD. Screens showed incoming Soviet missiles. For several minutes, officials believed it might be real. Fighter jets were prepared, command centers activated. It turned out to be a computer tape loaded incorrectly. In 1980, another malfunction showed 2,200 incoming missiles. Again, error. But think about the margin. Minutes. Just minutes between detection and retaliation. The entire nuclear doctrine was built on speed. Mutually assured destruction. MAD. The idea was simple and terrifying. If one side launches, the other launches. No winners, just annihilation. And here's what most people didn't realize. At the peak of the Cold War, there were over 60,000 nuclear warheads on Earth, enough to destroy civilization many times over. So why practice drills in classrooms? Why teach children to hide under desks? Because psychologically, humans need agency. Even symbolic agency. If you tell people there's absolutely nothing they can do, you get chaos. If you give them a step, even a small one, duck, cover, wait, you create order. You create the illusion of control. And illusion can be powerful. But it also leaves scars. Many adults who grew up during the Cold War describe recurring nightmares, flash dreams, a bright light, a shockwave, trying to find family members, trying to reach home. For some, the fear shaped career choices, military service, government jobs, civil defense roles. For others, it created quiet anxiety that followed them for decades. Because imagine being 8 years old and being told, calmly, that someday a bomb could fall from the sky, and your job is to hide under your desk. That changes you. And yet, here's the paradox. The drills may have prevented panic. The public preparation may have strengthened resolve. The visible readiness may have signaled to the Soviet Union that America would not crumble. In that way, practice became deterrence. The very act of preparing for war may have helped prevent it. But prevention came at a cost. Childhoods lived under countdown clocks, communities built with fallout shelter signs as decoration, television broadcasts that interrupted regular programming with civil defense instructions. A generation that learned to live normally while rehearsing catastrophe. And then, slowly, almost quietly, the world shifted. The Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union dissolved. The sirens were dismantled. Fallout shelters became forgotten basements, and duck and cover turned into a historical footnote. But if you walk through certain older buildings today, you'll still see them. Small metal signs, black and yellow, 3 triangles, fallout shelter, fading, like a memory most people don't talk about anymore. Because America doesn't practice nuclear war in public now. The drills are different, the fears are different, but the questions remain the same. How do you prepare a nation for something unthinkable? How do you balance honesty with stability? And how close were we, really? Closer than most people ever knew. For years, America lived with the possibility that tomorrow might not come. And instead of collapsing under that weight, it went to school, went to work, went to Las Vegas to watch the sky explode. It practiced. It prepared. It normalized the unimaginable. And somehow, it survived. But for those who remember the sirens, the drills, the flash of light in old black and white footage, the practice never fully leaves you. Because once you rehearse the end of the world, you never completely forget how it felt. And yet, there's one more layer most people never think about: the psychology of normalization. When something terrifying becomes routine, it stops feeling terrifying. That was the quiet transformation of the Cold War. In the early 1950s, atomic fear was sharp, new, unimaginable. By the late 1950s, it was scheduled. Drill at 10:15 a.m., math at 11, lunch at 12. The apocalypse had a timetable. Children joked about it. Teenagers referenced it casually. Comedians made atomic punchlines. The mushroom cloud became a design aesthetic. Fashion used it. Music referenced it. Movies dramatized it. Entire science fiction genres were born from it. Radioactive monsters, post-apocalyptic wastelands, doomsday scenarios. Fear didn't disappear. It became culture. And when fear becomes culture, it embeds itself quietly. Think about the architecture of that era. Thick concrete government buildings, suburban homes with reinforced basements, highway systems designed for evacuation. The interstate highway system wasn't just about commerce. It had military logistics in mind. Civil defense manuals were printed by the millions, pamphlets mailed directly to homes. How to survive an atomic attack. Can you imagine receiving that in your mailbox today? Not a movie trailer, not a news alert, a government guide on surviving nuclear war. And still, life went on. Weddings happened. Babies were born. Baseball seasons played out. Americans didn't live in bunkers. They lived above them. That's the strange resilience of that era. Fear existed, but it didn't freeze the country. It ran parallel to it, like a shadow. Always there, but not always acknowledged. And here's the part historians still debate. Did constant preparation reduce the chance of war? Or did it bring the world dangerously close to accepting it? Because when something feels rehearsed, it can feel inevitable. When you practice something long enough, it starts to feel like it might actually happen. During the height of tension, both the United States and the Soviet Union had systems on hair-trigger alert, launch-on warning policies. If radar detected incoming missiles, retaliation could be launched before confirmation. Seconds mattered. Human judgment mattered. And in multiple documented cases, human hesitation prevented catastrophe. False alarms, glitches, misread radar reflections. each one a potential ignition point. The world survived partly because individuals chose to wait, to question, to doubt the machine. That may be the most unsettling realization of all. The survival of millions depended on moments of restraint, not on drills, not on desks, not on backyard bunkers, on judgment. And eventually, something else happened. The children who practiced duck and cover grew up. They became voters, parents, policymakers. Some entered government, some entered science, some entered the military, and many carried with them a deep understanding of what nuclear war meant. Not abstract geopolitics, but personal stakes. Perhaps that awareness shaped negotiations. Perhaps it strengthened arms control efforts. Treaties were signed, warhead numbers reduced, hotlines established between Washington and Moscow. The language of absolute annihilation softened into deterrent strategy. The public drills faded away, but the memory remained. Today, if you ask someone who was in elementary school in the late 1950s, they can still describe the posture. Knees tucked, head down, arms over neck, waiting for a flash they hoped would never come. That muscle memory lingers. And that might be the true legacy of when America practiced nuclear war in public. Not the bunkers, not the sirens, not the Nevada test site, but the psychological conditioning of an entire generation, teaching millions how to live with the possibility of instant destruction and still show up to school the next morning. It's easy to look back now and call it absurd, to laugh at wooden desks as protection, to question the optimism of pamphlets. But in that moment, it was a nation trying to manage the unimaginable, trying to maintain stability in a world that had invented its own extinction. And maybe that's the most powerful takeaway. Human beings can adapt to almost anything, even the idea that tomorrow might end in a flash of light. America didn't collapse under that weight. It practiced, it rehearsed, it normalized, and then it moved forward. But if you listen closely, in the archives, in the old recordings, in the stories told quietly at dinner tables, you can still hear it. That rising, mechanical wail. The air raid siren. A sound that once meant, this could be the moment. And for a generation, it never completely faded. And here's the part no one likes to admit. It could happen again. Not in the same way. Not with classroom drills and cartoon turtles. But the technology never disappeared. The weapons didn't vanish. They were reduced, modernized, hidden. Today, thousands of nuclear warheads still exist. Submarines patrol silently beneath oceans. Missiles sit in underground silos. Bombers remain on alert. The doctrine is quieter now, less visible, but still present. The difference? We don't rehearse it publicly anymore. There are no school drills for nuclear attack, no government pamphlets in the mail, no atomic sunrise tourism. The fear moved from visible to abstract, from public ritual to strategic deterrence. But history shows something uncomfortable. The Cold War didn't end because the weapons stopped working. It ended because political systems shifted. Leaders changed. Negotiations succeeded. Human decisions altered the course. And that means human decisions matter now just as much. When America practiced nuclear war in public, it revealed something profound. A nation can live under existential threat and still function, still build, still dream, still innovate. But it also revealed how easily fear can be normalized, how quickly extraordinary circumstances can become routine, and how fragile the margin can be between rehearsal and reality. Think about that moment again. October 1962. A submarine commander hesitates. One vote changes. A decision not to launch. History turns. Millions live. That's how thin the line was. And if you zoom out even further, you realize something even stranger. The Cold War generation may have been the only generation to grow up fully aware that humanity had the power to erase itself. Not in myth, not in prophecy, in engineering, in megatons, in countdown clocks. That awareness shaped art, politics, foreign policy, environmental movements, space exploration. The drive to reach the moon wasn't just exploration. It was competition. A technological duel between superpowers. The same fear that fueled bomb shelters also fueled rockets. The same anxiety that built missiles built satellites. Fear and innovation marched side by side. And when the drills stopped, when the sirens fell silent, when the shelters gathered dust, something subtle remained. A quiet understanding that civilization is not permanent, that stability is not guaranteed, that the world can pivot on moments. Maybe that's why the Cold War generation often carries a certain resilience. They practiced for the worst, and lived long enough to see it avoided. But the rehearsal itself left fingerprints on culture, on parenting styles, on politics, on architecture, on storytelling. Because once a society imagines its own destruction vividly enough, it never fully forgets the image. So what do we do with that history? We don't romanticize it. We don't sensationalize it. We study it. We understand it. We remember that preparation can be stabilizing, but panic can be contagious. We remember that drills were about control in an uncontrollable world. And we remember that survival sometimes hinges not on firepower, but on restraint. When America practiced nuclear war in public, it wasn't because it wanted war. It was because it feared it, deeply. And that fear shaped a generation that hid under desks, that watched mushroom clouds rise in the desert, that stored canned food underground, that listened for sirens, and then grew up and carried on. If you were one of those children, you remember. If you weren't, it may sound surreal, but it happened. And for a time, it was normal. The end of the world, scheduled between math and lunch. And somehow, life went on. But let's go even deeper, because there's something almost surreal about how calm it all looked on the surface. Watch old footage from the 1950s. Bright classrooms, smiling teachers, neatly dressed children. The tone was steady, reassuring. If you see the flash, duck and cover. No panic in the voice, no trembling, just instruction. As if nuclear war were a thunderstorm, as if it were manageable. That tone wasn't accidental. It was engineered. Government officials understood something critical. If the public panics, systems collapse faster than bombs can destroy them. So the messaging had to walk a line. Serious, but not hysterical. Prepared, but not hopeless. Civil defense campaigns were carefully scripted. Posters used clean fonts and patriotic colors. Films featured friendly narrators. Even the famous 1951 film Duck and Cover used animation to soften the horror. A turtle. A smiling turtle. Teaching children how to respond to a nuclear blast. That image alone tells you how strange the era was. Because deep down, officials knew. A direct hit from a hydrogen bomb would vaporize entire blocks. There would be no desk to hide under, no time to react. So why teach it? Because survival wasn't only about the epicenter. It was about the margins. Those outside the immediate blast zone. Those who might survive the initial shockwave. Those who could reduce injury from flying glass. Those who might endure fallout if they acted quickly. Even small improvements in survival rates mattered in military calculations. And perhaps more importantly, the drills created psychological readiness. A nation that feels prepared is harder to intimidate, and intimidation was the Cold War battlefield. The United States and the Soviet Union weren't just competing in weapons, they were competing in perception, strength, resolve, credibility. The message was clear. We are ready. We will respond. We will not be paralyzed by fear. But here's the irony. By rehearsing nuclear survival so publicly, America exposed how vulnerable it truly was. Sirens on rooftops signaled that cities were targets. Shelter signs revealed that destruction was anticipated. The very act of preparation acknowledged danger. And yet, people adapted. Teenagers still worried more about prom than geopolitics. Families still argued over dinner. Life's small dramas continued. That contrast between normal life and existential threat may be the most defining feature of that era. Because while Washington debated megatons, kids worried about homework. While generals discussed first strike capability, couples planned weddings. While missile silos stood ready, drive-in theaters filled up on Friday nights. Human life is stubborn like that. It insists on continuity, even under shadow. And then came détente. Arms limitation treaties, strategic agreements. The tone shifted. The drills faded quietly. There was no grand announcement saying, "We are no longer rehearsing the end of the world." It just slowed, stopped. By the 1980s, nuclear fear returned briefly during renewed tensions. But the ritual of classroom drills never fully came back. Because something had changed. The world had stared directly at its own extinction long enough, and maybe learned that living constantly in rehearsal mode isn't sustainable. Today, if you mention air raid drills to younger generations, it sounds fictional, like something from a dystopian film. But for millions of Americans now in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, it was just Tuesday morning. There's something haunting about that simplicity. The end of the world treated like routine maintenance. And maybe that's the final lesson. Civilizations survive not just because of power, but because of adaptability. America practiced nuclear war in public not because it was reckless, but because it was trying to balance fear with function, trying to prepare without unraveling, trying to maintain childhood while acknowledging annihilation. And that tension between innocence and inevitability defined an era. It produced resilience. It produced anxiety. It produced innovation. It produced caution. It produced a generation that understood, perhaps more than any before it, that peace is fragile, that power is dangerous, and that sometimes survival depends less on desks and more on decisions. Quiet decisions, moments of restraint, moments of doubt, moments when someone, somewhere, chose not to press a button. And because of those moments, the drills remained drills. The sirens remained practice. The flash never came. But the rehearsal left its mark. Because once you've practiced the end of the world, you never completely forget how it felt to wait for it. And maybe that's the strangest part of this story. The bombs never fell. The cities were never vaporized. The flash never came. And yet, an entire generation grew up rehearsing their own extinction. They were told, gently, calmly, that the sky itself could become a weapon, that a bright light might mean the end of everything they knew. And instead of collapsing under that knowledge, they adjusted. They memorized procedures. They tucked their heads under desks. They went home after drills and did their homework. That is not weakness. That is adaptation. But adaptation has a cost. Because when children learn to live with apocalypse as background noise, something inside them changes. A quiet awareness settles in. An understanding that stability is temporary. That safety is conditional. That peace depends on people making the right decisions under unimaginable pressure. The Cold War wasn't just a political standoff. It was a psychological era. An age where humanity understood, for the first time, that it had engineered its own extinction. Not through myth, not through prophecy, through physics, through metal, through megatons. And the fact that we survived doesn't erase how close we came. It highlights it. The drills weren't foolish. They were a nation trying to hold itself together, trying to prepare without surrendering to panic, trying to give children something to do in a situation where control barely existed. Because sometimes, even symbolic action is better than helplessness. And maybe that's the deeper lesson. Civilizations survive not because they eliminate fear, but because they learn to live alongside it. They build routines around it. They normalize it. They carry on anyway. But normalization is dangerous too, because when the extraordinary becomes ordinary, we risk forgetting how serious it really is. Today, the sirens are quieter. The drills are gone. The fallout shelters gather dust. But the weapons still exist. The decisions still matter. The margin between restraint and catastrophe is still thin. And somewhere in the memory of millions of Americans, there is still the sound of that rising mechanical wail, still the posture, knees tucked, head down, waiting. When America practiced nuclear war in public, it revealed something profound about human nature. We can live with enormous fear. We can function under existential threat. We can raise families and build futures even when the horizon feels fragile. But we should never forget what that era required: restraint, communication, judgment, and the understanding that power without wisdom is catastrophic. The Cold War generation practiced the end of the world, and then grew up determined not to let it happen. That may be their quiet legacy. Not the drills, not the desks, not the mushroom clouds, but the decision, again and again, to step back from the edge. And perhaps the most important thing we can take from that era is not how to duck and cover, but how to pause, how to question, how to hesitate when the stakes are absolute. Because sometimes, the survival of millions depends on someone choosing not to act. The flash never came, but the rehearsal changed us. And once you've practiced the end of the world, you never completely forget how close it felt. (2:58 a.m., November 9th, 1979).
Perform EWO emergency LF evacuation.
We have an EWO evac.
Inside a secure command center deep beneath Cheyenne Mountain, warning screens suddenly lit up. Incoming missile trajectories, hundreds of them. The computers showed a massive Soviet nuclear strike headed toward the United States. The countdown to retaliation began. Military officers stared at glowing radar displays. The data suggested submarine-launched ballistic missiles had already been fired. Intercontinental ballistic missiles were on their way. Targets across American cities appeared on the screen: Washington, New York, Chicago, missile silos in the Midwest. In a matter of seconds, the unthinkable seemed to be happening. The North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, had trained for this exact moment for decades. Every drill, every simulation, every sleepless overnight watch had prepared them for a Soviet first strike. And now, the screen said it was real. Emergency procedures activated. Strategic Air Command was notified. Nuclear bomber crews were placed on alert. Missile crews in underground silos prepared for potential launch orders. The National Military Command Center in the Pentagon received the warning. There were only minutes to decide. If the United States responded incorrectly, it would trigger a full-scale nuclear war. If it hesitated and the attack was real, the country could be destroyed without retaliation. This was not a drill. At least, that's what the computers said. The Cold War had been simmering for more than 3 decades. Since the end of World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union had built arsenals capable of destroying the planet many times over. By 1979, both nations maintained thousands of nuclear warheads, many ready to launch within minutes. Mutually assured destruction was the doctrine. If one side launched, the other would retaliate. No one would win. The entire strategy depended on early warning systems working perfectly. Radar installations scanned the Arctic skies. Satellites monitored missile launches. Massive computers processed incoming data to determine whether an attack was real. On that early November morning, those systems indicated catastrophe. Inside Cheyenne Mountain, officers began verifying the data. They cross-checked radar feeds. They consulted other detection systems. Early warning satellites, designed to detect the heat signature of missile launches, showed nothing. That was strange. Ground radar stations also reported no confirmations of incoming missiles. Yet the main display continued to show a full-scale attack. hundreds of warheads. Time was passing. In the Pentagon, senior officials were awakened and rushed into position. Strategic bombers were prepared for takeoff. Some crews were already in cockpits, engines warming. The United States was inches from launching a nuclear counterstrike. And then, something didn't add up. The raw radar data did not match the computer projections. The satellites saw no infrared signatures. No independent confirmation existed outside the simulation system. Within minutes, officers realized the horrifying truth. The attack wasn't real. A training scenario, a simulation tape used for drills, had somehow been loaded into the live warning system. The computer believed it was under attack because it had been fed a practice scenario. The United States nearly launched nuclear weapons because of a training error. But this wasn't the only time. Throughout the Cold War, there were multiple moments when the world came dangerously close to nuclear war. Not because of deliberate aggression, but because of misunderstandings, technical glitches, or human error. The system that was designed to prevent surprise attacks was also capable of triggering catastrophe. To understand how close the United States truly came, you have to understand the machinery behind the warning. Deep beneath Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado, NORAD operated inside a hardened bunker built to survive a nuclear blast. Massive steel blast doors sealed the entrance. The facility was designed to withstand shock waves, electromagnetic pulses, even nearby detonations. Inside, teams monitored radar arrays stretching across North America. These included the Ballistic Missile Early Warning System, giant radar installations positioned to detect missiles launched over the Arctic. In addition, satellites known as DSP, Defense Support Program satellites, orbited the Earth, scanning for the heat plumes of rocket launches. These systems fed data into powerful mainframe computers. In the 1970s, those computers were cutting-edge, but primitive by today's standards. They relied on magnetic tapes, punch cards, and limited memory capacity. Simulations were routinely run to ensure readiness. Crews trained constantly for nuclear war scenarios. On November 9, 1979, a technician inserted a simulation tape, likely for a routine training exercise. Somehow, that tape was fed into the operational system. The screens displayed a full Soviet strike, and because the Cold War climate was tense, the warning was taken seriously. Just months earlier, tensions between Washington and Moscow had escalated over arms negotiations and geopolitical conflicts. Trust was fragile. Military exercises were often interpreted as potential threats. In such an environment, a computer glitch was not easily dismissed. The 1979 incident forced a full review of procedures. Officials publicly downplayed the severity, but privately, the implications were terrifying. If a training tape could almost trigger nuclear retaliation, what else could go wrong? It turned out, quite a lot. On June 3, 1980, less than a year later, warning systems again indicated incoming missiles. This time, the displays showed a smaller number. First 2 missiles, then 200, then 0, fluctuating unpredictably. Once again, bomber crews prepared. Once again, officials scrambled. The cause? A failed computer chip worth less than $1. A malfunctioning integrated circuit generated random numbers that the system interpreted as missile counts. The fate of millions had momentarily depended on a defective microchip. These incidents revealed a frightening truth. The early warning system was only as reliable as its weakest component. And in the nuclear age, even a minor malfunction could escalate beyond control. But perhaps the most sobering moment of the Cold War did not happen inside an American bunker. It happened on September 26, 1983, inside a Soviet early warning facility. Shortly after midnight, Soviet officer Stanislav Petrov was on duty when alarms sounded. The system reported that the United States had launched 5 intercontinental ballistic missiles toward the Soviet Union. Protocol required him to report the launch immediately. Retaliation could follow. But something didn't feel right. The system indicated only 5 missiles. An American first strike would likely involve hundreds. Petrov hesitated. He judged the warning to be a false alarm. He was correct. Sunlight reflecting off clouds had fooled the satellite sensors. Had Petrov followed procedure without question, the Soviet Union might have launched nuclear missiles in response. The world survived because one man doubted a computer. Back in the United States, officials quietly strengthened safeguards after the 1979 and 1980 incidents. Systems were separated more carefully. Training simulations were more tightly controlled. Redundancies were added. But the underlying dilemma remained. Nuclear deterrence required speed. Speed reduced time for verification, and reduced time increased risk. During the Cold War, decision-makers often had less than 10 minutes to determine whether radar blips represented Armageddon. Imagine being awakened at 3 a.m., told that hundreds of warheads were inbound, and being asked to decide whether to launch a counterstrike that could end civilization, all within minutes. That pressure defined the era. Americans living in the 1970s and 1980s grew up with air raid sirens, civil defense drills, and nightly news coverage of escalating tensions. The threat of nuclear war was not abstract, it was immediate. Yet few knew how fragile the warning systems actually were. The public believed in precision, in flawless radar and infallible computers. Behind the scenes, technicians wrestled with aging hardware, software limitations, and human error. The November 1979 incident was not widely understood at the time. Reports emerged gradually. Congressional investigations examined the flaws. Officials assured the public that safeguards were improved. But the reality remained unsettling. For a brief window of time, the United States believed it was under nuclear attack, and the only thing that prevented catastrophe was cross-checking data before pressing a button. In an age before the internet, before smartphones, before real-time global communication, those decisions were made in isolated command centers by small groups of officers relying on blinking screens and paper printouts. The Cold War was often portrayed as a chess match between superpowers, but sometimes it came down to a faulty tape drive, or a damaged chip, or a skeptical human being refusing to accept what a computer displayed. And as the 1979 false alarm faded from headlines, the systems remained on alert, every hour of every day, waiting, watching, ready to decide the fate of the world in minutes. The question was never just whether missiles would fly, it was whether the warning system itself could be trusted. And history shows that trust was tested more than once. In the years that followed the 1979 false alarm, military planners faced a paradox they could never fully solve.
The entire nuclear strategy of the United States depended on speed. If a surprise attack destroyed American missiles on the ground, the country could lose its ability to retaliate. That vulnerability was known as a decapitation strike. An attack meant to cripple command and control before leaders could respond. To prevent that, the United States adopted what was known as launch on warning. If incoming missiles were detected, the president could order a counterstrike before enemy warheads even landed. That meant the decision window could be as short as 6 to 12 minutes. Think about that. 6 minutes to confirm radar data. 6 minutes to wake the president. 6 minutes to verify intelligence. 6 minutes to choose whether to begin a nuclear war. And those minutes were often filled with uncertainty. The early warning radars were powerful, but not perfect. Ballistic missiles launched from submarines could appear suddenly on radar screens with very little warning. Atmospheric conditions sometimes distorted signals. Technical malfunctions occasionally created phantom blips. Computers were programmed to interpret patterns. If certain criteria were met, number of objects, trajectory angles, speeds, the system would flag a potential attack. But computers did not understand context. They did not understand politics. They did not understand human hesitation. They did not understand doubt. They only processed data. After the 1979 incident, engineers tried to make the system more resilient. Additional verification layers were introduced. Separate channels were created to ensure that training simulations could never again feed directly into live operational displays. But the fundamental structure remained the same. Detect, verify, decide. Behind the scenes, another critical system stood ready: the nuclear football. Wherever the president traveled, a military aide carried a briefcase containing authentication codes and communication tools required to authorize a nuclear launch. Inside that case were sealed cards with codes, known informally as the biscuit, used to confirm the president's identity. If a launch was ordered, the message would travel through secure channels to missile crews across the country. In underground silos scattered across the Great Plains, Air Force officers sat on constant alert. Each missile required 2 officers to turn keys simultaneously to initiate launch procedures. They trained repeatedly for that moment. During the November 1979 scare, many of those crews were placed on heightened alert. Bombers were readied. Communications lines were activated. Some accounts suggest that certain aircraft were even prepared for immediate takeoff, ready to disperse to avoid being destroyed on the ground. The public slept through it. Most Americans had no idea how close their country had come to responding to a non-existent attack. But inside command centers, the memory lingered. In the early 1980s, tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union intensified once again. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the NATO deployment of intermediate-range missiles in Europe, and escalating rhetoric increased suspicion on both sides. Military exercises became flashpoints. In 1983, NATO conducted a command post exercise known as Able Archer 83. It simulated a transition from conventional war to nuclear release procedures. The exercise was designed as a drill, but Soviet intelligence reportedly misinterpreted it as possible preparation for a real first strike. Soviet forces reportedly heightened readiness in response. For a brief period, each side viewed the other's training as potential aggression. This was the razor's edge of the Cold War. Mistakes did not need to be malicious. They only needed to be misunderstood. False alarms continued to occur, though not always publicly disclosed. Technical malfunctions, satellite misreads, and data transmission errors occasionally triggered investigations. Every time an alarm sounded, the process repeated. Check satellite data. Check radar confirmation. Check secondary systems. Consult commanders. Notify leadership. The goal was to avoid panic, but also to avoid hesitation if the threat were real. This balancing act defined nuclear command and control. In private briefings, military officials acknowledged that no system could ever be entirely free from error. Complex systems fail in complex ways. A small wiring problem could create cascading alerts. A software bug could generate phantom numbers. Human fatigue could slow verification. And all of it unfolded under the pressure of potential annihilation. For those working overnight shifts in command bunkers, the psychological burden was immense. They knew that if a real attack occurred, millions could die within hours. They also knew that if they made the wrong call during a false alarm, they could trigger the very disaster they were trying to prevent. The November 1979 incident became a case study inside military academies. It was examined as an example of how procedures, not just technology, prevent catastrophe. The system worked that night because officers did not immediately accept the computer's conclusion. They demanded confirmation. They cross-checked sources. They questioned the data. That skepticism may have saved the world. But the margin was thin. As the Cold War moved toward its final decade, both superpowers continued modernizing their arsenals. Missiles became faster. Warheads became more accurate. Submarine fleets grew more sophisticated. Warning times did not expand. In fact, as submarine-launched ballistic missiles improved, they reduced warning time even further. A missile launched from a submarine positioned off the U.S. coast could reach targets in under 10 minutes. That reality meant that the president might have even less time to decide than in 1979. Some strategists argued for shifting away from launch on warning, advocating instead for absorbing a first strike and retaliating afterward. Others warned that doing so could risk losing deterrence entirely. The debate was never fully resolved. Meanwhile, technology advanced, but so did complexity. The more interconnected the systems became, the more potential points of failure existed. And yet, despite the false alarms, despite the close calls, nuclear war never occurred. Not in 1979, not in 1980, not in 1983. Each time, something interrupted the chain of escalation. Sometimes it was technology correcting itself. Sometimes it was human judgment. Sometimes it was simple delay. For the generation that lived through it, the Cold War was not just geopolitics. It was a constant background tension, a low hum of possibility. School children practiced drills.
Families built backyard shelters. Television broadcasts discussed missile counts and arms treaties. And behind it all, hidden from public view, command centers waited for alarms that might never come, or might arrive without warning. The 1979 false alarm is often described as a glitch, but it was more than that. It was a demonstration of how fragile global stability could be. A training tape, a simulation, a mistaken input. And within minutes, the machinery of nuclear retaliation began to move. The world did not end that morning, but for a brief window in the darkness before dawn, the United States prepared as if it might. And the men inside Cheyenne Mountain understood something few others did. The greatest threat was not always an enemy missile. Sometimes, it was the system itself. And as long as nuclear weapons remained on alert, the possibility of another false alarm would never fully disappear. The screens would continue to glow. The radars would continue to scan. And somewhere, at some hour past midnight, someone would be watching, hoping that the next warning was only another mistake. By the mid-1980s, the United States had invested billions of dollars into making sure the events of November 9, 1979 could never happen again. New safeguards were written into protocol manuals. Simulation tapes were physically separated from live operational systems. Authentication procedures were tightened. Independent verification layers were expanded. But even with improvements, one uncomfortable reality remained. No early warning system could ever guarantee perfection. The structure of nuclear defense relied on overlapping technologies: ground-based radar, satellite detection, communication relays, encrypted authentication chains, and human confirmation at every level. Yet every layer introduced complexity, and complexity introduces risk. In 1995, years after the Cold War had officially ended, a new incident proved that the danger had not disappeared. On January 25, 1995, Russian radar systems detected what appeared to be a missile launch off the coast of Norway. The trajectory resembled that of a submarine-launched ballistic missile that could deliver a high-altitude nuclear burst designed to disable Russian radar. Inside Moscow, alarms sounded. The Russian nuclear briefcase, the equivalent of the American football, was activated for the first time in history. President Boris Yeltsin was notified. For several tense minutes, Russian officials debated whether they were witnessing the opening move of a nuclear strike. The object on radar was actually a scientific research rocket launched by Norwegian and American scientists studying the aurora borealis. Russia had been informed of the launch in advance, but the message had not reached the correct channels. For several minutes, the world once again stood near the edge. This incident occurred after the Cold War had ended. It proved that the danger was not confined to ideological rivalry. It was embedded in the structure of nuclear deterrence itself. Back in the United States, the lessons of 1979 remain relevant. Cheyenne Mountain continued operations for decades, eventually transitioning some responsibilities to newer facilities. The Cold War bunker, carved into solid granite, symbolized an era of constant vigilance. Inside, the atmosphere had always been intense but controlled. Officers trained to suppress emotion. Procedures were drilled repeatedly to ensure muscle memory under stress. When the false alarm occurred in 1979, what prevented disaster was not advanced artificial intelligence or flawless hardware. It was discipline. It was hesitation. It was the refusal to act on incomplete information. The system required people willing to challenge the data. This principle, trust but verify, became central to nuclear command philosophy. Every alarm required confirmation from multiple independent sources. Satellite detection had to align with ground radar. Communications had to remain intact. Analysts had to assess plausibility. Would an adversary launch only 5 missiles? Would a strike come without political warning? Would intelligence channels show heightened activity beforehand? These questions bought time. Time was the most valuable resource in nuclear crisis management. In 1979, the cross-checking process exposed the error quickly enough. But imagine if satellite data had also glitched. Imagine if radar interference had coincided.
Imagine if geopolitical tensions had been higher that week. The difference between false alarm and real launch often came down to context. Cold War historians later revealed that both the United States and the Soviet Union experienced dozens of false warnings over the decades. Most were minor. Some were serious. A few were terrifying. They were caused by everything from computer malfunctions to unusual cloud formations to reflections from the moon to faulty wiring to human misinterpretation. The public rarely heard about them in real time. Governments feared that revealing how often systems failed could undermine confidence, or worse, create panic. But those inside the system understood the fragility. They understood that deterrence worked not because machines were perfect, but because people were cautious. As the 1980s progressed, arms control treaties attempted to reduce the number of weapons on hair-trigger alert. Agreements like the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty sought to remove certain missile classes entirely. Yet thousands of warheads remain deployed. Even today, decades later, many nuclear weapons remain capable of launch within minutes. Technology has improved. Computers are faster. Detection systems are more sophisticated. But the basic structure remains similar. Detect, verify, decide. The events of November 9, 1979, serve as a reminder that systems designed to protect can also endanger. They reveal how close humanity can come to irreversible decisions because of technical error. And they highlight a deeper truth about the nuclear age. The greatest power ever created by civilization depends on fallible tools and fallible people. In the early hours of that November morning, officers inside Cheyenne Mountain faced screens that told them their country was under attack. They followed procedure. They demanded confirmation. They resisted panic. Because of that, no missiles were launched. The sun rose as it always had. Americans woke up unaware that anything unusual had occurred. Traffic moved through city streets. Children went to school. Businesses opened. The world continued, unchanged on the surface. But beneath that normalcy lay the knowledge that stability was thinner than anyone imagined. A tape inserted into the wrong machine, a chip that failed, a reflection of sunlight, a research rocket mistaken for a weapon. Each incident whispered the same warning. Nuclear war does not always begin with intention. Sometimes it begins with error. And as long as weapons remain poised for rapid launch, the line between mistake and catastrophe will always exist. The Cold War ended without the apocalypse many feared, but the systems built during that era did not disappear overnight. They evolved, they modernized, they persisted. The story of the 1979 false alarm is not simply a historical footnote. It is a reminder of how much depends on moments of doubt, on quiet decisions made in underground rooms, on individuals willing to question what the screen is telling them. Because in the nuclear age, survival has often depended less on power and more on restraint. Restraint is not dramatic. It does not make headlines. It does not come with celebration. It does not appear in history books with bold victories. But on November 9, 1979, restraint was the difference between continuation and catastrophe. When the screens inside Cheyenne Mountain lit up, the machinery of retaliation began to move exactly as it had been designed to move. Alerts were transmitted. Crews were notified. Strategic bombers were readied. Communication chains activated with precision. Nothing malfunctioned in the response. The failure had occurred earlier, quietly, invisibly, when a training simulation entered the wrong system. That is what makes the event so unsettling. The danger did not come from an enemy decision. It came from routine, from familiarity, from procedure, from the everyday operations of a massive defense apparatus. The Cold War is often remembered through dramatic moments: the Cuban Missile Crisis, Berlin, proxy wars overseas. But the 1979 false alarm reveals something subtler and perhaps more disturbing. It shows that even in the absence of confrontation, the world remained at risk. Not because leaders wanted war, but because systems were built to move quickly. Speed was considered strength. Automation was considered reliability. Readiness was considered security. Yet speed reduces deliberation. Automation reduces intuition. Readiness reduces margin. The officers who cross-checked the data that morning did something profoundly human. They paused. They noticed the satellite data did not match the projections. They saw that radar confirmation was missing. They questioned the assumption that an attack had begun. In those minutes, skepticism outweighed fear, and that hesitation preserved peace. It is tempting to view the survival of the Cold War as inevitable, to assume that because nuclear war did not happen, the system must have worked perfectly. History suggests otherwise. The system worked because individuals refused to let it operate blindly, because technicians verified, because analysts double-checked, because commanders waited for confirmation. The November 1979 incident forced leaders to confront a difficult truth. The safeguards designed to protect civilization could also endanger it if not constantly questioned. In response, procedures were revised. Redundancies were strengthened. Training protocols were separated from live systems. But no reform could eliminate uncertainty entirely. Even today, early warning systems remain active. Missile detection satellites still scan for infrared plumes. Radar arrays still sweep across the Arctic horizon. Command centers remain staffed around the clock. The architecture of deterrence continues, and with it, the same fundamental tension remains. The need to act quickly balanced against the need to be absolutely certain. The false alarm of 1979 did not trigger war. It did not produce explosions. It did not change borders. It did not appear on front pages the next morning. Its significance lies in what almost happened, in how close a chain reaction came to beginning, in how ordinary a mistake can become extraordinary when paired with irreversible power. For those who lived through the Cold War, the threat often felt distant yet constant, a shadow stretching across decades. But inside underground bunkers and command centers, that shadow was measured in minutes. 6 minutes, 10 minutes, sometimes less. Minutes in which the fate of cities, nations, and generations could be decided. On that November morning, the decision was not to launch. Not because of luck alone, but because human beings, trained, disciplined, cautious, insisted on proof. That insistence prevented an irreversible act. The story endures as a quiet reminder that the stability of the nuclear age has never rested solely on weapons or treaties. It has rested on judgment, on doubt, on the willingness to question what appears certain. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of all. In a world equipped with extraordinary destructive power, survival has depended not on aggression, but on patience. Not on speed, but on verification. And not on machines, but on the people who choose when not to press the button.